Have you ever wondered what happens to the faces that once filled every cinema screen, the voices that once made entire theaters fall silent, the men and women whose names lit up giant letters over Hollywood Boulevard, and then one day disappeared like a film reel abruptly cut? This is the story of one of those faces, one of those names. His name was Daniel Cross, and once upon a time in the golden glow of 1980s American cinema, he was the man every magazine wanted on its cover, the actor every director begged to cast, the smile every audience trusted. But fame is a guest, not a resident. It comes, it dazzles, it promises eternity, and then one day it quietly packs its bags and walks out the back door. Sometimes it doesn't go alone, it takes everything with it. Daniel grew up far from Hollywood, in a small, dusty town in Texas, where the only theater played one film a week and the popcorn always tasted slightly burnt. His father was a mechanic with oil permanently stained into his hands, and his mother worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. They didn't have much, but they had an old, flickering TV that became Daniel's first window to another world. As a kid, he'd sit cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide, watching black and white films of old American legends, actors who could make you cry with a single look, laugh with a small twitch of their mouth. At night, he'd stand in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, repeating lines he'd heard, trying out expressions, pretending the reflection was an audience. One day, he whispered to himself, "They'll watch me," not out of arrogance, but out of desperate hope. When he turned 19, he left town with a duffel bag, 2 pairs of jeans, a worn-out pair of boots, and a heart full of stubborn dreams. He arrived in Los Angeles with no plan except this: he would not go back home a failure. The city was bigger than anything he'd imagined. Glass buildings, endless traffic, people rushing everywhere, no one knowing his name. He slept in a cheap motel at first, then on a friend of a friend's couch, then in his beat-up car for a while when money ran low. By day he worked as a waiter, a delivery guy, a parking attendant. By night he stood in lines outside casting agencies, auditioning for roles as guy at bar, soldier 3, man in background anything. Rejection became a language he understood fluently. Not the right look, too intense, not intense enough. We'll call you. They almost never did. And then one day, someone did call. It was a small role at first, a cop in a low-budget crime film. But when the movie came out, critics noticed something. The young actor in the small role, Daniel Cross, has a quiet intensity that steals the scene. That one line in a review was like a tiny flame in a dark room. A few months later, he got a bigger role, then another, then a lead. The momentum built slowly, then suddenly, like a wave that had been traveling underwater the whole time and finally crashed into shore. By the mid-80s, Daniel Cross was not just working, he was glowing. He starred in a war film that made audiences sob. He played a troubled musician in a drama that critics called a masterpiece. He became the face of American cinema's wounded hero, the man who looked strong on the outside but carried storms inside his eyes. Directors said he was easy to work with, intensely focused, respectful. He never smashed trailers or demanded absurd luxuries. He just wanted to work. His father, still in the same little Texas town, would sit in that old living room, watching his son's name appear in giant letters, tears silently slipping into his coffee. His mother would cut out magazine articles and paste them into a scrapbook, whispering, "That's my boy," like it was a prayer. But success has a price, and Hollywood rarely lists all the fees up front. The height of his fame, when Daniel could barely walk down a street without being recognized, the vultures started to appear. They didn't look like vultures. They wore suits and carried leather briefcases. They shook his hand warmly, smiled softly, said words like future, security, legacy. They told him he was working too hard to worry about money. "Let us handle it," they said. One of them was a manager named Victor Lane, sharp jawline, expensive watch, voice like silk. Another was a financial advisor named King, polished, precise, trusted by many high-profile clients. They told Daniel the same thing: "You're an artist. You shouldn't have to think about numbers. We'll protect you." And Daniel, a boy from Texas who had grown up with nothing and suddenly had everything, believed them. He trusted them the way audiences trusted him on screen. For years, everything seemed fine. Movies came, awards came, big houses, fast cars, glowing interviews. His name appeared in golden lettering on theaters across the country. He flew to New York for premieres, to Europe for festivals. He answered fans' letters. He took photos with strangers. On the outside, he looked untouchable, a star carved into the sky. But inside, slowly, silently, cracks had begun to form. First crack appeared as a quiet rumor, the kind nobody takes seriously. A small-time journalist wrote that Daniel Cross had cash flow issues. His manager laughed it off. "Ridiculous," he said. "We're restructuring some investments. It's all part of a long-term plan." Daniel didn't know how investments worked, so he nodded and went back to learning lines. But the rumors grew. A missed payment here, a bounced check there. A confused call from a tax office that Daniel never saw because someone else took the message. And the roles started to change. Hollywood is cruel to age. The hero becomes the father. The lead becomes the mentor. Eventually, the mentor becomes forgot. In his 50s, Daniel was still handsome, still talented, but the industry had moved on to younger faces, faster trends. Social media stars who had never struggled a day in their lives were suddenly headlining movies while he auditioned for supporting roles. He didn't complain. He still loved acting, but the checks were smaller now. And the financial wolves were hungrier. One evening, he received a letter that felt like a punch. It was from the IRS. According to their records, he owed a sum of money so large it looked like a typo. Unpaid taxes, penalties, interest, years of misfiled documents. He stared at the numbers like they were written in another language. There must be a mistake, he told Victor, and panic rising in his chest. They assured him they would take care of it. But weeks passed, then months. The letters kept coming, more urgent each time. Auditors started poking into his records. There were discrepancies, accounts he'd never heard of, shell companies in his name, investments that didn't exist. Slowly, horrifyingly, the truth began to unspool. The people he had trusted to protect him had been draining him dry for years. While he had been busy being America's on-screen hero, the people behind the scenes had been quietly writing the script for his real-life downfall. The day it all collapsed, he went to the bank to withdraw cash for something simple, grocery shopping, he joked to himself. When the teller gently told him the account was, the world around him went silent. There must be a mistake, he repeated, but his voice sounded far away. There was no mistake. The house mortgaged and leveraged, the cars leased unpaid, the savings redirected, the retirement fund a lie. Victor and were gone, phone numbers disconnected, offices emptied. His life, once filled with premieres and cameras, narrowed down to a small printed statement with more red numbers than black. News travels fast when it smells like scandal. Tabloids screamed, former star broke, late-night hosts made cheap jokes. Fans shook their heads and said it was sad, then scrolled to the next headline. People assumed he'd blown his money on drugs, on parties, on stupidity. Few asked what really happened. Fewer cared. Hollywood moved on. His home was taken, his possessions auctioned. Memorabilia that once decorated red carpets and film sets were sold to strangers who would hang them on walls as conversation pieces about that actor who used to be famous. Daniel found himself in a small, old apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles, sitting alone on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by peeling wallpaper in silence. For the first time since he was 19, he had nothing. No agent, no manager, no money. No family, his parents long gone, his friends busy, his phone filled with numbers that no longer called back when the spotlight was gone. Some nights he sat in front of a cheap, cracked mirror, staring at his aging face. The man in the reflection looked like a ghost of the boy who once dreamed in front of a bathroom mirror in Texas. The lines on his forehead were deeper, the eyes dimmer. Fame had left not only his bank account but his body. He thought about disappearing completely. No dramatic ending, no public announcement, just fading quietly into the background like an extra in someone else's movie. But something small and stubborn inside him refused. One day, while sorting through a box of old things the bank hadn't taken, he found a faded photograph of his father holding his grease-stained hands up and laughing, and another of his mother's tired but proud smile on the night his first movie premiered. Between them, like a bridge, was a younger Daniel in a cheap suit, eyes shining, unaware of everything that would come. On the back of one photo, his father had written, "Whatever they take from you, they can't take who you are." His hands shook as he traced the words, "Who you are." For years, he had allowed Hollywood managers, fame, and betrayal to define that. But sitting there, broken, forgotten, he realized something. They had stolen his money, his comfort, even his reputation, but not his craft, not his love for the work, not the thing that had gotten him here in the first place. He couldn't go back and change the contracts he hadn't read, the signatures he had given blindly, the trust he had placed in the wrong people, but he could choose what to do next. He could drown quietly in bitterness, or he could start again, not as the boy chasing fame, but as the man who finally understood its cost. He began small. He contacted a legal aid group that specialized in fraud against artists. At first, they didn't believe him. He was just another fallen star with a sad story. But when he brought boxes of old documents, letters, statements, the ugly truth began to emerge. Victor had orchestrated a long-term theft, forging signatures, hiding accounts, misreporting income. They had done this not only to him, but to others, retired singers, forgotten TV actors, athletes whose names had once meant something. Daniel's case became part of a larger investigation. For the first time in years, he was no longer just a victim. He was a witness. Legal justice is slow. It doesn't pay rent. While the case moved through courts and investigations, Daniel needed to survive. So he did something he never imagined he'd do. He went back to the beginning. He started visiting small local theaters, places with squeaky chairs, handmade posters, and actors who still rehearsed lines in hallways lit by a single buzzing light. The first time he walked into one, people stared. Some recognized him. "Aren't you?" they whispered. He nodded, embarrassed. "I used to be," he said quietly. When the director asked what he was doing there, Daniel replied, "I want to work any role, any size. I just want to act." Those small, dusty stages, something miraculous happened. He found his craft again. There were no trailers, no makeup teams, no rows of cameras, just scripts, old wooden floors, lights that sometimes flickered, and an audience of 50 people who came not for a name but for a story. At first, some came just to see the washed-up Hollywood guy. But after a few performances, they came for Daniel the actor again, not Daniel the fallen star. His performances were quieter now, deeper, stripped of vanity. He knew what loss felt like, what betrayal tasted like, and it bled into every line he delivered. Younger actors watched him, not as a relic, but as a lesson. He began staying after rehearsals to help them, giving tips on stagecraft, on camera presence, on handling rejection. They listened not because he was famous, but because he had scars. Word spread in a different way this time, not across billboards, but across small artistic circles. A well-known independent film director saw him in a tiny play and approached him afterward. "You're better now than you were in your big movies," the director said, eyes bright. "There's something raw in you, something honest. I'm making a film about an aging actor trying to rebuild his life. I want you to play him." Daniel laughed softly at the irony, but he agreed. Film was shot on a modest budget with a skeleton crew and borrowed locations. No trailers, no luxury, but the script was real. It felt like someone had taken his soul, laid it on paper, and asked him to read it aloud. He gave everything he had to the role, not for fame, but because it was the first time in years he felt truly seen. When the film premiered at a small festival, no one expected much, but the audience sat in stunned silence when it ended. They didn't just clap, they stood. They cried. Critics wrote, "Daniel Cross delivers the performance of his life," and this time it wasn't about his face or his charm, it was about the truth in his eyes. Slowly, doors opened again, not the giant golden gates of blockbuster studios, but smaller, sturdier doors, the kind that lead to work built on respect, not hype. He became a mentor to younger actors, a symbol of resilience. Interviews changed. People no longer asked, "What was it like to be famous?" They asked, "What was it like to lose everything and still keep going?" And he answered honestly, without bitterness. He spoke of contracts nobody reads, of trust misplaced, of the way the industry chews up its own. But he also spoke of small stages, of the beauty of starting over, of the relief that comes when you stop needing to be loved by millions and start appreciating being known by a few. Years later, when the legal case finally concluded, the courts ruled in his favor. Some of his stolen money was recovered, not all, but enough to feel like a moral victory. Victor and were exposed, their names dragged through the legal mud they had created for others. New laws were proposed, protections for artists strengthened. Newspapers that once mocked him now printed headlines like, "Daniel Cross helps uncover decades of financial abuse in Hollywood." He didn't smile in triumph. He just exhaled. Justice didn't bring back the years, but it closed a chapter. In his 70s, Daniel stood on a small stage after a performance of a play where he played a grandfather teaching his grandson about courage. The audience had thinned. He wasn't a trending topic anymore. But the people who stayed were the kind that didn't come for a selfie. They came for something real. After the show, a young man approached him, eyes shining. "Sir," he said, "I grew up watching your old movies with my dad. I know what happened to you, the money, the scams, everything. I just want to say, you make me believe it's still worth trying. Even if the world eats you alive, it's still worth chasing something you love." Daniel smiled, really smiled, the way he hadn't in years. "Then it was all worth it," he replied. Because in the end, his story wasn't about a celebrity falling and climbing back to where he was. It was about someone learning that who he was mattered more than what he owned or who knew his name. Fame had given him everything and then taken it away. Betrayal had stripped him of comfort and illusion. But somewhere in the middle of losing his house, his fortune, and his image, he had found something he never had when his face was 10 feet tall on a screen. He had found himself. If you've ever felt like your best days are behind you, like you missed your chance, like someone stole your future while you weren't looking, remember Daniel Cross. Remember the man who went from red carpets to cracked mirrors and back to something more honest than both. A quiet stage, a small audience, a story told with every scar he carried. He didn't end his life as the biggest star in America. He ended it as something far rarer, someone at peace with the role he finally chose to play. Not the invincible hero, not the tragic victim, but a human being who refused to let betrayal write the last scene of his story.